So a few days ago, I asked you to submit questions about the circulatory system. And I was going to spend some time today answering some of those questions. So a lot of you had some really good questions. Some of them I even had to research. So we're going to spend some time, and depending on how long it takes, I haven't even read through these out loud. I just went through and prepared some answers for some of those questions. So when I'm not going to go and talk forever, so I'm going to read some, and then if I need to spend a few other minutes on another day answering the rest of them, then I will. Some of you asked similar questions, and so I've tried to combine many of them together so that it's not as redundant and hopefully doesn't bore you. But let's get started, and we will just see how long this goes. So I hope you find this helpful and that it will help your understanding a little bit more. So first question I had was, why was blood red? And this was kind of phrased in particular to the fact that it was more to the point of blood is mostly plasma. So if it's more plasma than red, why does it appear so red? So remember, you have basically three parts to your blood. You have white blood cells, you have plasma, and you have your red blood cells, your erythrocytes. And the question was, well, there's more plasma than anything else. So why is it still red? Well, the short of it is red is just a stronger color. It reflects more. So because there's red there, and it's almost even. It's like a 55, 45, 50, with 1% red, white blood cells being in there. So almost a 55-45 split. So the plasma doesn't completely overwhelm the red blood cells. And so it still appears very red because the reflection of the red light is so strong. However, there's a reason why it's red in general. So let's talk about that for a second. Blood is red because it is made up of cells that are red. Now, why are those cells red? There's a reason why they're called red blood cells. You have to kind of think of what are those red blood cells made of. And remember, we kind of talked about how they weren't really cells, right? They don't have a nucleus. They don't reproduce by mitosis because they don't have a nucleus, and they don't have a lot of other organelles, but they're vital because they have hemoglobin. Now, why is hemoglobin important? Well, hemoglobin is necessary because it's what binds the oxygen to those red blood cells. And so every hemoglobin is a protein, and every one of those proteins is made up of a subunit called hemes. And those hemes are actually what give those cells, and therefore your blood, the red color. Now, one important factor that actually your book did not talk a whole lot about is the fact that iron is a main component to those hemoglobin proteins. It's the iron within those hemes that do the binding actually to the oxygen. Well, and you guys know that there's that metallic taste to blood. Anytime you've lost a tooth, you have tasted that metallic part of the blood that's in your mouth. Well, that's because there's iron in there, and there's a lot of iron. Every hemoglobin protein has iron, and that iron is what helps the oxygen bind to the hemoglobin. And what causes the redness there is actually the interaction between iron and oxygen. There are those chemical bonds, which will help. Once you take chemistry, you'll understand this even more. But the chemical bonds between the iron and the oxygen that are binding the iron and the oxygen to that hemoglobin reflect light. And that's why it's red. It reflects red light. So all of that works together, and it really is just that chemical bonding, that chemical reaction that causes the binding of oxygen to iron, and the iron is in the hemoglobin, that reflects that red light. Okay, and that's why blood is red, and honestly, it's just that the red light being reflected overpowers the clearness-ish, for lack of a better term, of the plasma. So another question was, how much blood can a person lose before it becomes harmful? So you can lose about 1 liter of blood before things get dire. You can go with 4 liters approximately. Your blood volume on average for an adult is 5 liters of blood, and you can lose about 1 liter of that before you need some serious medical attention. Okay. Another question, we talked about how your blood clots when there's a cut. So thankfully that happens, even a small cut sends signals out and tells your blood that you need to stop the bleeding. And that's really, it's really a chemical signal that is sent. And so what happens is you have platelets that are tiny blood cells that help your body form clots to stop bleeding. So if one of your blood vessels get damaged, and that's what happens every time you bleed, a blood vessel gets damaged, there's a chemical signal that gets sent out, and the platelets recognize that chemical signal, and the platelets rush to that area and try to start clotting. Okay. So they are directed to a spot. It's not just that they're passing around and like, oh, there's a hole there. No, they actually have it's a chemical response that that they are acknowledging there. They've been given that information. Somebody asked, when was it discovered that red blood cells were not really cells? Well, once they could start seeing them under a microscope and really start, I don't know what time frame that was, but remember the cell theory, people started seeing things under the microscope in the 1600s, but then that was very basic. But I could actually try to look this up, and I could not find the timeline as far as when they figured out they didn't have a nucleus. I couldn't give you a specific date on that. All right, someone said, what happened if the platelets didn't work, or what conditions cause platelets not to work? So I did a little research on this because there could be many reasons for there to be clotting problems, but some of the clotting problems are not a platelet issue. So, but one in particular that is a platelet issue is called thrombocytopenia, okay? Thrombocytopenia, I can spell that. It's THROMBOCITOPENIA. And that is a condition where you have a low platelet count. And the reason it's called thrombocytopenia is because platelets are sometimes referred to as thrombocytes. Your book did not mention that, I think, but just so you know, that if you ever heard the term thrombocytes, that's another term for platelets. So those are, those are your colorless cells and the colorless material. And just as we talked about, they stop the bleeding by clumping and forming plugs, and that's how we start building clots so that we don't bleed continuously when we get any kind of injury. But thrombocytopenia, I just did a little research about, what causes it, but it's generally a bone marrow disorder, which is, we talked about bone marrow already a little bit, but sometimes people who have leukemia can also suffer from thrombocytopenia, as well as certain immune system disorders can also cause a lack of platelets to be made. And also, it can be a side effect of, you can end up with a low platelet count because of certain medications that you're taking. And this can affect both children and adults. So it's not a specific genetic disorder necessarily. It can be brought on by other things, and it kind of as a side effect of certain conditions. But it can be a problem. Sometimes it's mild. I did a little research, and it doesn't cause many problems. But in rare cases, you can have a platelet count that's so low that you can have internal bleeding. But there are treatments for it. Now, I did want to distinguish the difference between a low platelet count, like what we just talked about, and hemophilia. You've probably heard of hemophilia before, and you hear that term hemo. When you hear the term hemo, it relates to blood. Like hemoglobin is the protein that binds the oxygen to our blood, so that our blood cells can carry it. But hemophilia, it's not a platelet issue. It's a problem with something called when you need something called a fibrin clot. they don't have, there are certain, when we don't have time to go into all of it, but again, they don't have a low platelet count. They actually are lacking certain clotting factors. So as you can tell, the circulatory system is extremely complicated, and there can be numbers of things that can go wrong with it. But hemophilia is not a platelet loss or a low platelet count. It's dealing with a lack of certain clotting factors, and something called a fibrin clot can't be made, or it's made so thin that continued bleeding happens. Okay, so just a little bit of a difference there between those issues. What happens if blood flow slows too much? That was another one. Well, that's typically just considered having poor circulation, and that can happen for a number of reasons. But what tends to happen is if the blood flow slows down too much, you can imagine certain body parts are going to be lower on oxygen. So you might, in your extremities especially, because those are the furthest away from your heart. So you might have numbness and tingling in your hands and your feet. You can have cold hands and feet because of poor circulation. Sometimes it can cause swelling in your lower extremities, your feet, your ankles, and your legs. Depending on if it blocks the flow or slows the flow to the brain, you could have memory loss, difficulty concentrating, fatigue, just lack of oxygen. You can have cramping, lack of oxygen. Your skin can change color, lack of oxygen. So it all is, it's just because you're not going to, your certain parts or all of your body is not going to get enough oxygen, and therefore several different side effects can occur. Do red blood cells, someone asked, did red blood cells just go with the flow? I mean, the flow of blood, I assume is what that meant, or are they directed by something else? So the description, are they basically just little cars? And I think what the question was asking is, do they know specifically what part of your body to go to? And that's a yes and no answer. Yes, they are just pumped out of your heart and just they start doing going to where they need to go. But what happens is the process of diffusion takes over. So as your oxygenated red blood cells are flowing past other cells in your body, those who have lower oxygen concentrations are going to receive that oxygen from the red blood cells. And so some of your red blood cells are going to deposit early, and some of them are going to keep on flowing through your body and depositing as they progress through the body. So it's all contained in your, all the blood, oxygenated blood are going through your arteries. There's no roadmap, so to speak. It's a diffusion process. So as cells need oxygen, those oxygenated red blood cells are there to provide it. And they just keep going and pass back over into the veins once they need to make their way back up to the heart and lungs. All right, so the book and the notes did compare lymph and plasma. And that's a comparison that can only go so far. So one of the questions was, what is the difference between lymph and plasma? Well, they're both mostly water. So that is how they are similar. A few other things are similar too, but the thing to keep in mind is that the real difference, while they're both mostly water, they just serve completely different functions. So lymph is the clear white colors of fluids, which are composed of lymphocytes. Those are your white blood cells. The location is obviously different. Lymph is located in the lymphatic vessels and the lymph nodes, and it's part of the lymphatic system. So hopefully you remember that that's your immune system, and it's responsible for helping white blood cells get where they need to go in order to fight off diseases. The main functions of lymph are supplying nutrients to the body, removing waste from tissues, maintaining the composition of tissue fluid, so keeping the homeostasis where it needs to be for biological functions. It helps in invading, keeping things that shouldn't be in your body out, or putting a quick stop to those as they try to come in. And it also helps to absorb vitamins and other digested fats that come through the small intestine, through the lymphatic vessels. Now, if you want to talk about what your plasma does, generally it's helping to regulate body temperature, helps regulate water content of the cells, protects against excess loss of blood through clotting, helps regulate the pH of your body by regulating the acid and base levels within your body. And it's a transportation system for gases, enzymes, nutrition, and hormones to where that needs to go. So another question, does a more rapid heartbeat change the amount of blood being pumped? No. Good question. Your body has a pretty standard volume of blood between an adult, we said about 5 liters. So anywhere from 4.5 to 5.5 liters of blood. So that volume doesn't change and your heart does not beat more per pump. But what is happening is when you increase the heart rate, that's because you need more oxygen. So your heart is the amount of volume passing through your heart at any one pump is the same, but it's pumping more frequently, therefore your blood is getting reoxygenated more and more and more quickly. But that volume stays the same, the volume per pump stays the same, but when you pump faster, you're pumping more in a given period of time because you're trying to, for whatever reason, if you're exercising, if you're nervous, if you're in a stressful situation, your heart rate increases. And so that's because certain parts of your body need more oxygen in that particular moment. So the idea of arteries and veins, where arteries flow away from the heart with oxygenated blood, veins return to the lungs and the heart with deoxygenated blood. That's a very critical issue, a very critical body function that is vital for life. And someone asked, is there a condition that exists where deoxygenated blood is contained in the arteries? And that can happen. And those are because there's a problem with your valves. And remember, we have valves that close, or they're one way, that'll keep deoxygenated blood from flowing backwards and possibly passing through the capillaries and getting back into the arteries, because deoxygenated blood in the arteries does us no good. But there is a condition, and it's called regurgitation. Sometimes it may be called blood or valve insufficiency or valve incompetence, but it happens when a valve does not close properly and blood leaks backwards instead of moving with the one-way flow. So if too much blood flows backwards, then what happens is only a small amount is going to travel forward to your body's organs, and then your heart tries to make up for this by working harder because your body is sending signals that you need more oxygen. And then if it makes your heart work too hard, it's a muscle. So it's actually going to become enlarged, and you don't want to have a bulging heart. Bulging biceps may be good. Bulging heart, not so good. All right, so if your heart has to work extra hard to get oxygen to the rest of your body, then it's going to grow like any other muscle. And so that is not good. Because an enlarged heart is actually not as effective. Okay, and then another question on that same vein was, what would happen if oxygenated and deoxygenated blood flowed the wrong way? Similar question. There are some conditions that can cause this, particularly something called ventricular septal defect. That's a hole in the heart, and it's not uncommon. It's actually a pretty common heart defect that's present at birth, and doctors can usually pick up on it pretty quickly. It occurs in that wall. If you go back and look at that picture of the heart in your textbook, there's that wall, that septum, that separates the lower chambers, which are the ventricles, from the upper chambers, the atria. And if there's a hole there, you get some crossing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, because that septum serves as the allowance, or what allows that separation to get blood to pass from the left to the right side of the heart. The oxygen-rich blood gets pumped back to the lungs. This is the mistake. So if you have that hole in your septum, the oxygen-rich blood can get pumped back to your lungs instead of out to the body. So then again, that is going to cause your heart to have to work harder. And then that's if there's that hole in the septum. Okay. If it's small, if it's a small problem, then you may, I mean, if it's a small hole, a very tiny hole, you may not have any problems. And sometimes a doctor will just, if you have a baby at birth who has a small hole in their heart, sometimes it's referred to that, then the doctor say, let's wait and see if it's small enough, because a lot of times your body does the repair work on its own. But in what's considered a medium or a larger VSD, that ventricular septal defect, that hole in the septum, if it's bigger, they can do corrective surgery to fix that. And then another question, which we'll close out with since we've been going for about 20 minutes, is how many liters of blood are in a teenager? Well, good question. But get this, there's generally no difference in blood volume between a 5 and 6 year old. So by the time you start grade school, basically, you have the same amount of blood flowing through you as a grown adult. So once you're about 5 or 6, you have about 5 liters of blood, and that doesn't change. All right. I will stop here. Thank you for those of you who submitted those questions. I really appreciated it. It made me do some research. I hope it helped to answer some questions. If you have more questions, feel free to respond to this assignment, and I'll try to get to those. And I know I didn't get to everything yet. And some of your questions I actually could not find answers to, even though I tried. So if you feel like I didn't do your question justice, it might be because I actually couldn't find any information about it, and I had never learned anything about that question either. Okay, it wasn't that I was necessarily ignoring it. Hope you guys are doing well. Tomorrow, today is Tuesday. Tomorrow, I want to have one last live session, just about 30 minutes from 11 to 11:30. So on Wednesday, I would love for everyone to come to class at the same time from 11 to 11:30, and we'll kind of wrap up the year, have discussion. I'd like your feedback on what was your favorite topic, what was your least favorite topic. So if you could be thinking about that, that would be great. If you come, it is a 10-point quiz if you come and you participate. So what that means is you come, I want to see your faces, don't black out your faces, and I want you to be able to answer what your favorite topic was and what your favorite lab was. So if you can think about that, I would really appreciate it. Okay, I hope you guys have a great Tuesday, and I look forward to seeing you on Zoom on Wednesday.